What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Iron Breed Podcast. My name is Austin, and today is going to be a little bit different. I'm going to quickly run through some nutrition stuff, how to kind of build your own diet, just lay down the ground tools for what you need to build a diet. So, if you aren't familiar, I do nutrition coaching, and I've been doing nutrition coaching for quite a few years now. And what I'm just going to share with you how I personally structure diets for my clients and how I go about making certain changes for them, and that some tips and tricks that I've learned along the way. So you better go grab a notebook, a pen, pencil, and take some notes, because even if you don't want to specifically coach people, if you're just looking to learn how to do this for your own good, it's super simple stuff. I mean, I guess to me it's simple, but it's because I've been doing it for a while. But it's not anything that's super challenging, and you'll see why when we start going through everything here. So generally speaking, everybody's going to have a little bit different goals. I will say though, most of the people that do contact me about doing nutrition coaching are generally reaching out because they're interested in some form of weight loss. So there's a couple different ways that we like to attack this. Now, specifically speaking, when it comes to building out plans, people will be like, oh, do you track your calories? Do you track your macros? I personally prefer to do macros. For me, it's easier to manipulate. It's easier to kind of explain, give a little bit more freedom. Now, granted, essentially at the same end of the day, it's the same thing as counting your calories, because if I'm giving you macros, obviously the macros all equate to a certain number of calories. The only difference is, instead of obsessing over how many calories you're consuming, it's just, okay, I need to get my macro targets. These are my macro targets. I don't know. For me, it seems to work a little bit better, and it seems to work a little bit better for everybody that I work with. Maybe it's the way that I structure it, I'm not sure, but everybody's going to have what works best for them. So I usually like to start with protein. Most of the people that I work with are fit, active, or they are engaged in some sort of weightlifting activity, which is great. So obviously our protein demands are going to be a little bit higher because we're working out more, and we need more protein to help facilitate recovery as well. So, but also protein in itself can also be kind of thermogenic. So generally speaking, most people, I like to start out roughly about their body weight in protein. But I do find that for some of my clients, taking them slightly higher. So what does that mean? Anywhere from like 20 to potentially 40 grams more than what their body weight is in protein. So for example, I weigh 204 pounds right now. Now, my protein intake is up around 260. That's where it was when I started dieting. However, if I were coming to myself as a client right now, I would probably give myself about 240 grams of protein. So why? Obviously, that's a pretty decent amount of protein. The reason why I would do that much protein is because not only is protein essential for building protein or building muscle mass and helping recovery from exercise, but protein is also thermogenic in a way. It is very hard for your body to break down protein, and by doing so, it actually burns a little bit more calories. There's been some really interesting research where you have two groups that are given equal amount of calories and a caloric deficit, and then you give another group, or one of those groups, an extra meal of just protein. So naturally, they're eating more calories in general, correct? So you wouldn't expect for them to lose any weight or to lose as much weight as the other group who's consuming less calories. However, in the research, they both lose the same amount of calories. Or they both lose the same amount of weight, my apologies. So if they're eating more calories, but they still lose the same amount of weight, then what exactly is going on there? So really what they're talking about is protein being thermogenic. Now, I'm not saying just because you eat a lot of protein are you going to be able to eat more food and not lose or to be able to lose more weight, it doesn't always work like that. But for most people, eating a little bit more protein is not going to kill them. The other reason why I like to load up a little bit more on protein is because protein, when combined with fibrous vegetables, is actually more filling and creates a more satiated feeling for the individual that's dieting. The longer you're dieting, the hungrier you become, and it becomes really hard to deal with that hunger. Hence why I drink a shit ton of carbonated water, the flavored seltzer water, on a pretty regular basis, because it helps me cope with being hungry. In addition to all the protein and fibrous vegetables that I eat, right? So I like to load up a little bit more on protein. So anywhere from 1 to 1.25 grams per pound of body weight is roughly about where I'm going to roll. And I like to divide that up evenly per the amount of meals that they're going to be eating that day. So everybody's going to be a little bit different. Most of my clients do at least 5 meals a day, but some of them do 6. And so I will divide the amount of protein up evenly in those meals. So that's pretty standard. And that's the first thing that I do with pretty much every client. The next thing that I do is I take a look at carbs. So if you're building muscle, obviously getting a little bit more carbs in your system is not going to be a terrible thing. If you're trying to lose weight, obviously, yes, we need carbs, but we don't need as much carbs. So depending on what the individual's body weight is, generally determines how I go with carbs. So what do I mean by that? Specifically in this scenario, if you have a slightly heavier individual, I'm going to give them roughly about their body weight in carbohydrates. When we're starting out a diet for the first time, I like to be conservative, because you can always work your way back down. But if you start too low, you can't always go back and work your way back up. And plus, it's really discouraging. So yeah, it might be really good short term to start low and have your client experience a whole bunch of weight loss. But then when they start stalling out and things get real funky, it's not sustainable in the long term, and you're gonna have to bring them back up. And their body might not adapt in the way that you're liking. So I like to be conservative, start a little higher, so that way it's like, okay, this is a pretty good spot, and we can slowly work our way down from there. So that's how I like to do these things. So roughly speaking, if you're looking to cut, I usually start with 1 gram per pound of body weight. If you're looking to bulk, I start with 1.5, because then it gives us some flexible room to work with. So then, what I like to do specifically is I like to utilize nutrient timing. That's stacking most of your carbohydrates around a period of time when you're going to be working out. So what I'm going to do, let's just say I'm doing this for me again, I'd be eating roughly about 200 grams of carbohydrates. Let's just say I train in the morning. My first 3 meals would be stacked with, I would personally do anywhere from 65 to 75% of my carbs in those first 3 meals, because my body is going to utilize those carbohydrates more efficiently around that workout period. On the flip side, if I were bulking, I would still stack most of them there, but I would probably let a little bit more bleed through into other meals, because obviously, depending on how many times I'm eating a day, I only have so much room to put all types of food, unless you really want to eat like 100 plus grams carbs per meal. But I just find it's more applicable to give your body the carbs when it needs it, as opposed to like when you're just sitting around like doing nothing, working. So I find that the body, at least I know this has worked really well with a lot of my clients, is that just giving it to them during those time frames has been really effective. So then what I like to do is I like to fill the space that's left with fat. And so I have some kind of golden rules for which I operate with fat. I like to start at a moderate level, and I don't like to cut too much lower than a certain area. So, for example, for females are going to require a little bit more fat for just optimal hormonal function, and that's just a fact. So I don't really like to go below 50 grams of fat for a female unless it's like a certain situation where you're like really trying to get shredded and you have to do some like bodybuilding style stuff. Okay, cool, get it. That makes sense, and that's justifiable in my book. Men, similarly, I think 40 grams is roughly about the lowest I would go for a natural male. If you're not natural, you can probably get away with a little bit less because your hormonal functioning is not really determinant on your fat intake. So that will make a lot of a difference as well, relatively speaking. And it also makes a difference if you're not natural with your protein intake, because you could probably get away with eating a little bit more because your protein absorption and nitrogen retention is going to be increased as a result of not being natural. Additionally, I guess you could say the same to a degree about carbohydrates. You might experience a little bit more ability to work with the carbohydrates that you're giving. Ultimately, though, it's really going to be situational and super dependent. So I like to take the amount of fat that I give. I usually stack the majority of it, probably 75 to 80% of it, in the meals where we don't have the carbs coming in. So that way, when we're doing the carb timing, if I'm training in the morning, we're probably looking at something like a pre-workout meal being my same amount of protein, higher carbs, and a small amount of fat. Intra-workout, I'll probably drink some aminos and carbohydrates. Post-workout, I'm going to ingest protein and carbs, no fats. The meal after that, I'll start slowly reintroducing a little bit more fat into my diet. It'll be a lower amount, kind of like my pre-workout meal, but it would also, have a slightly more elevated level of carbohydrates. So now, so let's just say I'm eating 5 meals. So now we're coming into meals 4 and 5. Now you're going to start seeing a shift. My fat levels are going to increase as I'm going to start dropping my carbs. Why? Because it's further away from my workout period, so I don't really need that. So now I'm going to be sitting at my desk doing work, so I don't really need to be consuming as many carbs because I don't need it to be fueling what I'm doing. I'm at a resting state that my body can easily utilize fats for fuel. So I'm going to increase the amount of fats that I'm consuming and decrease the amount of carbs that I'm consuming towards the end of the day, and vice versa. Now, if I were training in the evening, you would just take this whole thing and you would flip it. I would probably start out not eating any carbs in the morning and just proteins, fats. And then as throughout the day, as we get closer to my workout period, I would start adding in more proteins, I would start adding in more carbohydrates, and I would start taking out more fats. And so you kind of see that like inverse relationship that is being created. And it's really just kind of trying to give your body the fuel sources that it's going to need when it's going to need them. So that's kind of how I tackle that. Roughly speaking, with fat, I don't always have a set amount. It kind of depends on the goal of the individual. Generally, most males 200 pounds and above, I will start them out with roughly around 80 grams. And then we kind of go from there. Females, depending on how big they are, how much they weigh, 60, 70 grams. I often find that most females don't eat enough fat. I find that they generally have some sort of thought process where eating fat makes them fat, which is not true at all. Actually, females, like I mentioned earlier, need that fat more than men do, generally speaking, for hormonal function, especially for estrogen functioning, but that's a different story, and that's not what we're talking about here. So I like to make sure that we're getting enough fat. And I mentioned that I have my lower levels of fat that I will willingly go to. So when we are making adjustments, I like to take a look at, so if we're cutting, I like to alternate between cardio and food. So if I'm making a cardio adjustment, I won't make a food adjustment unless we're like super far along in a cut. Conversely, if I'm making a food adjustment, I'm not making a cardio adjustment. And I like to keep them small. So I like to make like cardio adjustments of like 5 to 10 minutes. depending on where we're at. Sometimes maybe even adding a whole extra day, depending on how long we've been stalling out. Conversely, if we're building muscle, it really comes down to adding more macros into the plan. So I like to make those additions come from protein or from carbs and fats. When I'm taking away from diets, I usually take fats first, and then I'll start taking from carbs. But I will only take fats, roughly speaking, until I get close to that low-ish level that I'm okay with, and then I start taking from carbs. Generally speaking, because the fats don't really affect how you're feeling when you're training most of the time. So that's why it allows people to start cutting a little bit more and still feel a little bit better because they have a little bit more carbs in them. And then as you get further along in the cut, you start taking out a little bit more of those carbs. And then that's where maybe somebody's going to start feeling it a little bit in the gym. But we're talking you have to kind of get pretty deep at this point and be doing a pretty decent amount of cardio, because I like to try and focus on the long game here, because it's a marathon, not a sprint. If you're kind of jumping into it and running into it too fast, it's not going to be a good time. So with that being said, if you're building mass here, then additionally you're going to want to, I also like to alternate. So obviously, because you're not really doing cardio when you're trying to build mass, you can't alternate between cardio change or a food change. You just add more food. But I like to not throw massive amounts of food on. I like to maybe only do like 100 to 200 calorie bumps at a shot, just enough to elicit a change. I don't really like to make too big of changes, and I don't really like to make a lot of changes at once. I like to get the most out of each change that we can. If you ask any single one of my nutrition clients, I am definitely not a fast results type of guy for that reason, because I like to get the most out of each change that we can. However, you'll find that it's super sustainable in the long term because you're not forcing your body to rush through something that is not ready for Cali. And so generally speaking, that's how I like to structure my diets. Cardio, with that being said, a lot of times it's really funny. You see people doing super crazy stuff, where they'll like set the incline to like 15 and like the speed super ridiculous, and they're like hanging on for dear life. And you're like, dude, by you hanging on to the treadmill the whole time, you're kind of defeating the point. You'd be better served just decreasing your speed, your incline, and just doing a steady rate, but not holding on to the side rails, and not like hanging on for dear life, and just doing time and distance. Also, the more intense you make your cardio, you keep in mind you're going to have to recover from it. That's something that you're going to have to recover from. And at the same time, that's like, why would you add more stress that you're going to need to recover from? Because your body's only going to have so much ability to recover because you're already in a caloric deficit. So obviously we're doing the opposite of what we're trying to accomplish. When you're adding calories, though, obviously you can maybe even push a little bit more in the gym, do a little bit more volume, keep pushing more volume, because you have extra calories, so you can afford that extra poundage and, be able to recover a little bit more. However, with that being said, you need to make sure that you also give yourself a chance to recover, because, your body needs time to recover, to repair, rebuild. And if you're not giving the time enough to do it, then it's not going to be able to do what it needs to do. And so then you're going to be back to square one. So I hope you found that helpful. I tried to keep it clear, concise, to the point, just factoring in when I'm making these when I'm making these diets, or when I'm starting out making these diets. These are kind of like the thoughts that go through my head and how I process these things, and how I generally set it up. A very basic way of how I set up these diets for everybody. Obviously then, there's going to be more specific things that go in, like food choices, food selections, food timing for certain things. But it's going to be really person dependent. It's going to be dependent on what their needs are, their current status, because really nutrition for most people, like, what is the right answer to do this? Depends. Well, what's the right way to do this? It depends. There's so many things that are ultimately variables that we don't really know or have like the right answer to. And the best answer most of the time really is depends. And also, a tip on building sustainable long-term success, something that I've learned through a few different work positions as well as clients that I've been working with is, not everybody's going to be able to do chicken, broccoli, and rice forever, for every meal. That just doesn't work for some people. You need to kind of cater the diet to their lifestyle of what they can actually, because maybe sometimes people can't, with work, eat 5 times a day. Maybe they can only eat 3 times a day. Okay, well then you got to find ways to do that. You got to find special snacks. Maybe they're trying to cut and they really have a hard time, not eating certain foods. Okay, well maybe you need to figure out ways to work that into there, because if they don't enjoy their diet, they're not going to stick to it. And if you don't stick to it, you're not going to be able to get the results that you want or that you're looking for. So in order to make sure everybody stays consistent, the best way to ensure consistency is make it enjoyable. Because if you enjoy it, you're going to do it. And then the more you do it, the more results you're going to see. It's just going to create a paradigm of, oh, wow, this was good. I enjoy doing this and I see results, which is only going to reinforce wanting to keep doing that. And then by wanting to keep doing that, you're going to keep seeing results and it's going to keep moving forward. So really just build it in a manner that is enjoyable to your client or yourself. If you're listening to this and you want to do it for yourself, you gotta make it enjoyable. So if it's not enjoyable, nobody's gonna want to do it, and they're not gonna be able to do it for a long time. So hopefully this was helpful, and hopefully you found some value in this. If you have any more specific questions, do not hesitate to shoot me a message on Instagram. You can reach me on my page at the Zekman, or you can reach me on the Iron Breed Performance page. Please leave a comment, leave a review. If there's something that you feel that I didn't talk about or I didn't explain well enough, let me know, and I can definitely make a post on the Iron Breed page and go over it in a little more detail. Once again, my name is Austin. It has been great talking to you, and we'll be back to our regular, normal program schedule on Monday. So anyway, you have a good weekend. We'll see you next time. Thank you for listening to Iron Breed Podcast.